India and China share some unique similarities. Both are continent-sized countries with 1.4 billion people, both are ancient civilizations. The remarkable progress China has achieved in the last 4 decades led some to expect India to take a similar trajectory. When it failed to sustain the same growth as China, many started seeing India as a failure. But these expectations have been unfair from the beginning. India has always been very different from China. In this video, I'll explain why India's path had to be slower and messier. For more than 2 millennia, with cyclical interruptions, China has been a centralized state that encompassed a vast and populated territory. The cycles that characterize Chinese history span centuries and can be defined by a pattern of imperial unification under various dynasties, fall, a period of turmoil, and then re-establishment of the centralized state under a new dynasty. India's history has been completely different. For most of its existence, the Indian subcontinent has not been united under a single kingdom or empire. Instead, it was composed of a variety of rich and powerful kingdoms. When India was unified, for example under the Mauryan Empire or the Gupta Empire, it culturally influenced regions far beyond its political borders. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia and China. Hindu art spread to Indochina. However, since India was usually divided into multiple kingdoms, it was an attractive target for invaders. But the Indian civilization was strong enough to survive them. Over time, the cultures of the invaders were absorbed and mixed with its own, giving Indian civilization a unique type of resilience. To understand this resilience, we must look at the world order according to Hindu cosmology. In Hindu cosmology, time moves in vast, almost infinite cycles called yugas, millions of years long. These cycles consist of the rise and fall of kingdoms, the inevitable destruction of the universe, and its recreation. Each cycle brings new kingdoms to life, destined to experience their own periods of glory and decline. Invaders come and go. Greeks, Turks, Afghans, Mughals, Europeans. They rule for a century or two, then melt into the Indian Ocean of culture. In the end, they represent insignificant events in the infinite nature of cosmic time, and the harm produced by these invaders is irrelevant from the perspective of the infinite cycles. This is why India today is one of the most diverse nations of the world, ethnically, religiously, and linguistically. In China, your identity was defined by whether you were part of the Chinese Empire or a barbarian. In India, identity was not about belonging to a state. You could be Buddhist, Jain, Hindu, later Muslim or Sikh, speak Tamil or Bengali or Punjabi, and still belong to the same timeless cultural universe. The last of India's many invaders, the British, profoundly shaped the India that exists today. The colonial era represented a deep decline for India, a period that saw the country's economy remaining behind the rest of the world. Before colonization, India's economy was roughly 20 to 25% of the world's GDP. By the time the British left in 1947, this share had dropped to just 3%. This dramatic economic decline led to the widespread impoverishment of the Indian populace. The British systematically dismantled local industries, most importantly being the world-leading textile trade, leading to deindustrialization and pushing millions into poverty. But ironically, this period of decline also paved the ground for the future unified state. The British by accident helped bring India into existence. They connected the diverse regions with rail lines, established English as a common language for administration, and drew borders. By training the Indian elite in British institutions, they unwillingly reawakened the national consciousness among educated Indians, inspiring the sentiment that to expel the foreign rulers, India had to become a modern nation. In short, Britain created a physical skeleton of a unified India, and then, in 1947, realizing that the era of colonialism was coming to an end, handed the keys to the people who wanted it gone. In August 1947, when Jawaharlal Nehru raised the Indian flag in Delhi, he was attempting something that had never been done before, turning a civilization into a single democratic state that had to keep united hundreds of languages, castes, religions, and former kingdoms. Today, India remains the world's most complex federation. To prevent this fragile union from disintegrating, the Indian constitution gave a high degree of autonomy to its various regions. Bureaucratic rules, labor laws, land laws, even school textbooks can differ dramatically from one state to the next. While this preserved the union, it came at an economic cost. with bureaucratic systems differing from one state to another, moving goods or establishing businesses across state lines became a logistical nightmare. This internal situation, born of necessity, severely slowed economic growth. China never faced this problem. In October 1949, when Mao's troops marched into Beijing, they were doing something deeply familiar, restoring a single, centralized empire that had existed with some interruptions for 2000 years. This difference is most starkly visible in language. When the leader of China delivers a speech, virtually every citizen understands it. In India, there is not a single language understood by a majority of the population. A speech given in Hindi might be unintelligible to a citizen in Tamil Nadu or West Bengal. The lack of historical hegemony in the Indian subcontinent, combined with the great diversity of its people, is the main reason why India cannot be like China. The China model, which relies on rapid top-down mobilization of a homogeneous population, simply cannot function in a country like India. This is why it is superficial to simply compare the GDP charts of the two giants and blame India for falling behind. India became independent in 1947, and the communists completed the unification of China in 1949. Let's see how the historical inheritance of each country influenced its path to modernization. At the end of the 1940s, both countries started from a similar point: poor, mostly rural, and scarred by colonialism and war. However, the choices made in those first decades have been crucial to the later development of the two nations. The centralized power has been an important factor in China's implementation of various policies. Literacy campaigns sent students and soldiers into villages. By 1980, China's literacy rate had jumped from 20% to over 60%. Basic healthcare reached the countryside for the first time. Life expectancy rose from 35 years in 1949 to 65 by Mao's death in 1976. These were not gentle reforms, often enforced at gunpoint and costing lives, but they created in just one generation a healthy, minimally educated and disciplined workforce ready for industrialization. India went the opposite path. Land reform was attempted, but in most states it was blocked or watered down by powerful landlords who sat in the same parliament that was supposed to pass the laws. By 1980, more than half of India's rural population was still either landless or owned plots too small to live on. Instead of mass literacy campaigns, India built elite institutes like the famous IITs that produced world-class engineers, but for only a tiny fraction of the population. The rest of the education system remained neglected. In 1991, India's literacy rate was still only 52%. China stood at 78% already. Both countries called themselves socialist, but each had its own understanding of socialism. China's command economy was sometimes brutal, yet when the leadership wanted something done, a dam, a steel plant, a railway, it happened fast and on a gigantic scale. India created the infamous license rush, thousands of pages of rules dictating who could produce what, how much, and where. To open a factory, you needed dozens of permits from different ministries. Increasing production beyond a certain limit was literally illegal. The result was that from 1950 to 1991, India's GDP grew at a Hindu rate of growth, around 3.5% per year, of which 1.5 to 2% was population growth. So the actual per capita growth was barely 1.5% a year. Despite catastrophic setbacks like the Great Leap Forward, China's industrial base grew at roughly double that pace. By the time Mao died in 1976, China already had a basic industrial base, near universal basic education, life expectancy higher than India's, and an army of young workers with no memory of landlord oppression. India in 1976 still had 70% of its population in agriculture, widespread malnutrition, a private sector strangled by regulations and a political system that made radical change almost impossible. India's restraint protected its democracy, but at the cost of hundreds of millions left in poverty for an extra generation. By 1991, when India finally began liberalizing, China had already enjoyed a decade of dense reforms and was pulling away at rocket speed. The race was not lost in the 2000s or 2010s. It was already decided by choices made in the 1950s and 1960s. By 1991, the Hindu rate of growth and the suffocating license rush had led India into its worst economic crisis since independence. The situation was desperate. India had run out of foreign currency. The government had enough money to pay for only a few weeks of essential imports like oil and food. But this crisis was the spark that ignited a change. The then Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, realized there was no alternative but to reform the old system. In a historic speech quoting Victor Hugo, he announced, "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." That idea was liberalization. Almost overnight, the LPG reforms, liberalization, privatization, and globalization dismantled the license rush. The government abolished the industrial licensing system. You no longer needed permission from a bureaucrat to build a factory or increase production. State monopolies were broken up, allowing private companies to enter sectors like telecommunications, airlines, and banking. India finally opened its doors to foreign investment and lowered import tariffs, integrating itself with the global economy. When China opened in 1978, it followed the classic East Asian development model. It moved farmers into low-skill factories to produce cheap goods for the world. Everyone expected India to follow the same path, but it didn't. Despite the reforms, India's rigid labor laws and poor physical infrastructure made building massive factories difficult and expensive. However, India had one accidental advantage left over from the colonial era, which I mentioned in part 1, the English language. India had a large population of English-speaking, technically educated graduates who needed very little infrastructure to work, just a computer and a satellite link. So, while China became the factory of the world, manufacturing clothes, toys, and electronics, India became the back office of the world. Western companies began outsourcing their software development, customer support, and accounting to cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad. The IT sector boomed, creating a new wealthy middle class and putting India on the global map. This explains the modern difference between the two giants. China's manufacturing rise lifted hundreds of millions of peasants out of poverty by giving them factory jobs. India's services boom created immense wealth, but mostly for the urban, educated middle class. It left the vast rural population behind, creating two Indias, one flying to the moon, the other still stuck in the agrarian 19th century. The strange reality of India, in which, on the one hand, it has a space exploration program and world-class engineers, while on the other hand it has a large portion of the population living from subsistence farming, is the reason why people often have different views on India. Some choose to see the first part and portray India as the future. Others see the second and believe that India will never rise. But like two faces of a coin, both are true. This is what makes India interesting. Its unique culture and history have led to a unique situation in the present. In this video, I have often compared India to China, with China usually emerging on top in my comparisons. This isn't because I want to portray China as better, but rather to show that history matters. The past influences the present, and it often dictates the speed limit of development. However, a nation's destiny isn't entirely determined by its history. Since 2017, India has consistently grown faster than China. Infrastructure is finally being built at Chinese speed, manufacturing is slowly picking up. India has the potential to become a superpower eventually. It simply requires more time to reach that status. If it achieves this, it will join an exclusive group of nations, including the USA, China, and potentially Russia. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. And write your thoughts in the comments, I will read them all. I'll see you in the next video.